I've seen a lot of tools, a lot of programming tools, a lot of great programming tools um, get developed, get released, get used by programmers over the last almost 30 years now. And I have to tell you, out of all the tools that I've seen, GitHub Copilot is by far the most amazing. It's amazing in so many ways. So I got started with Copilot about 2 years ago. So it was back in July of 2022. So I guess about a year after it was released originally, or at least released in beta. And I remember being on the GitHub website, and there was an offer for like a free trial if I signed up for it. And so I did. And I installed Copilot, and I had used a couple of other tools similar to it prior to trying out Copilot. So I thought it might be helpful, but the other tools weren't too great. So I was thinking, maybe Copilot wouldn't be too great either. About 2 hours into working on my first project using Copilot, I had to create a complicated unit test for a Next.js React application that I was building. And I wasn't sure how I was going to mock a certain set of objects in terms of writing this unit test. I had installed Copilot a couple of hours earlier, and as I was starting to code out the unit test, 30 lines of code instantly appeared on the screen. In those 30 lines of code, it had all of the code that I needed to mock the object that I needed to mock. I was amazed. I was sold on Copilot at that point. In all my years of writing software using code completion, IntelliSense, or looking things up on Stack Overflow, I had never seen a tool that could understand the context of what I was coding and then give me a suggestion that was nearly perfect on how to solve my problem. And that's when I realized the programming world was going to be changing. Now, at the time, I was the only person that I knew who used Copilot. I tried sharing it with some other developers. They didn't really take too much of a close look at it. And then about, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months later, if you all remember, in the fall of 2022, that's when ChatGPT came out, version 3. And generative AI, OpenAI, ChatGPT, these became names that everybody in the household knew. Mom, dad, the grandparents, the kids, everybody started to learn about ChatGPT, generative AI, how you could use it to answer all these questions and solve all these problems that would require previously a bunch of Google searches and clicking through links. You could go right to ChatGPT and get your answer. It was at about that time that people started to really pay attention to what Copilot could do for them. Because Copilot is really just generative AI geared for programming. So it's kind of like a special use case with a bunch of extra little bells and whistles, a special use case for what the more generalized tools like ChatGPT are able to do. And at that point, that's when Copilot started to get the attention of the software development industry. And of course, throughout the year of 2023, everyone started adopting Copilot. Microsoft and GitHub really started promoting Copilot, not just to individual users, but upgrading it so that it would be appropriate for uses by businesses. Earlier this year, they turned on GitHub Copilot Enterprise. And so now this has become a tool not just utilized by a couple of individual developers who were willing to try a free trial. Now it is something that is basically being deployed throughout the enterprise. Just like text editors 40 years ago started to revolutionize how software development was done, instead of doing punch cards and stuff like that, you could now code in a text editor. Just like tools like code completion started making the editing experience a lot better back in the 90s. Well, now we have GitHub Copilot, and it really changes the game in a lot of ways. As we go through our presentation today, I'll be talking about some of the ways in which I think it's going to change the programming world. I'll also try to address some of the concerns, legitimate concerns, that some programmers or even businesses have about Copilot. So as much as I'm going to talk about Copilot, promote the use of Copilot, I definitely want to talk about the good and the bad of it so you have a balanced view, so you can understand why this is such a great tool, but also make sure that you learn how to use it the right way. And that really is the key, learning how to use the tool the right way. So let's start off first. Copilot is an AI pair programmer. That statement cannot be overstated. One of the biggest mistakes that people make when they start working with Copilot is they think of Copilot as a code generator. Please do not think of it that way. If you think of Copilot as a code generator, you're going to end up making a lot of mistakes with it and miss out on some of the best value that it actually offers. Yes, Copilot does generate code as part of using it. But the way to look at Copilot is similar to the way you would look at pair programming. So how does pair programming work? You have one computer, one keyboard, one mouse, one monitor, but two chairs, one for each programmer. One programmer is coding, the other one is actively watching and contributing along. Then after a while, the two programmers switch, the other programmer starts coding, and the other one actively contributes. The way to think of Copilot is that AI pair programmer that basically comes alongside you and helps you to do your coding. Just like when you're writing code and your pair programming friend would code review what you're coding, or when your pair programming friend is coding, you would code review what they're coding. That's how you work with Copilot. When Copilot generates code, many times you will be able to accept the suggestion and just use it. But many times you'll also have to make some tweaks and modifications to it. Also, when you're writing your code, you can use Copilot to code review you and offer you suggestions and improvements and ideas on maybe better ways to solve a problem. One of the big things that's promoted about Copilot is that it makes you faster. In some ways, it can make you faster, but I don't really think of that as the primary benefit. And in fact, in some cases, it might even slow you down slightly. Not because it's giving you bad code, but because Copilot, when used as a pair programmer, forces you to really look at code, to really think about the code, to do code reviews with Copilot, to look for better ways to do things. How many of us have gone to Stack Overflow before and copied a bunch of code from Stack Overflow, pasted it into a file and ran it, but we really couldn't explain what we copied and pasted? With Copilot, when it makes a suggestion or offers you a suggestion in response to the code you've already created, Copilot can not only make that suggestion, but it can also explain to you what that code does. So many times since using Copilot, the biggest value that I've seen from it was not the actual generation of code, but its amazing ability to explain to me the code within the context I'm using it, something that traditional documentation and other tools like Stack Overflow just can't do for you. And that's one of the reasons why Copilot is so transforming. Another thing I want to mention too about Copilot is that Copilot works really well with almost all languages. Sure, some of the really old languages that aren't that popular, Copilot's not so great with. Some of the languages or libraries that we're using that literally just released new features, a lot of times Copilot struggles with that until it gets trained on them. But for the bulk of the programming that we do, especially in the enterprise space, which is definitely somewhere between the really old stuff that nobody uses anymore and the latest stuff that came out yesterday, Copilot provides excellent, excellent support. And what's really interesting is this: when I teach my Copilot classes, as Ann mentioned, I will teach it with whatever language you want. So if you want to do a Java class, we'll do Java. You want to do C#, we'll do C#. But what I'll sometimes do in those classes is I'll pick some other language nobody in the class has ever heard of before, and I'll repeat the same demonstration in that other language. And that's when people really, truly start to realize the value of Copilot. In a sense, and don't take my example too far, but in a sense, Copilot almost makes the programming language an implementation detail. That doesn't mean you don't have to know your languages or know how to properly use them or be able to adequately code review. But what you will find is, instead of identifying yourself as a C# developer or a Java developer or a C++ or a Python developer, what you'll start to realize is when you use Copilot properly for both generating code, reviewing code, and learning code, you will be able to jump between different programming languages in ways that you would have never imagined. So instead of just being limited to PHP because that's what you happen to know now, you can embrace that project that would be better implemented in Python or better implemented in C# with fewer problems and fewer issues. So that's really what Copilot is it's really starting to elevate natural language, natural human language, to that almost to the point of being a programming language in and of itself through the various prompts and stuff that we give Copilot. So, Copilot. GitHub provides a couple of extensions that you can install in your editor to make use of it. The first thing to know is that Copilot is actually a service provided by GitHub. You must have an active license. Even if you already have a paid account for accessing code repositories and GitHub Actions and stuff like that, Copilot itself is an additional license fee on top of that. You can get an individual license, or if you're part of a larger company, you can get it through GitHub Copilot for Business. You can get that through the company that you're working for. In terms of the extensions, there's two extensions. There's one that provides the code suggestions, and there's one that provides the Copilot chat. You might be asking yourself, why are there two extensions? You have to understand the history of Copilot a little bit. When Copilot first got started, it was just code suggestions. That was the feature set that I first discovered when I first started working with it back in July of 2022. But later on, once things like ChatGPT became super popular and people were using things like ChatGPT for programming purposes, a new feature called Copilot Chat was added to Copilot. What's interesting is, as awesome as the code suggestions are, in my opinion, 80% of the value of using Copilot is the Copilot Chat. So if you are making use of Copilot Chat within your company, make sure that your GitHub administrator not only enables Copilot, but specifically enables Copilot Chat, because it is technically possible to use the code suggestions without the chat feature. But I'm here to tell you, all the cool stuff that you hear about Copilot, 80% of all that cool stuff is all provided by the chat one way or another. So you definitely want the chat feature. Now, Copilot is an in-editor experience. Now, there are a couple of things that have been added to it here recently. For example, you can use Copilot with the GitHub CLI. If you have an enterprise account with GitHub, you can use Copilot as part of doing things like pull request descriptions and other things like that. But the real core feature part of it is the in-editor experience. People will often ask me, can I incorporate Copilot into like my build pipeline or something like that? The answer is no. It really is designed to be a pair programmer for that in-editor programming experience. So if you have your Copilot subscription, then which editors are supported? Visual Studio Code is probably the most commonly used editor in the world. It supports both the Copilot suggestions and the Copilot chat. And it's the one that I'll be using here the most as we get into the demonstrations here shortly. Copilot code suggestions and chat are also supported in regular Visual Studio. They are also supported in the JetBrains IDEs. So if you use PyCharm, WebStorm, IntelliJ, all of those JetBrains editors support code suggestions and chat, as well as Visual Studio Code and regular Visual Studio. Now, you'll see in my list here, I have NeoVim listed. NeoVim, as well as Azure Data Studio, both support Copilot code suggestions, but they do not support the chat feature. So if you want the chat, you're limited to regular Visual Studio, VS Code, and the JetBrains IDEs. If you want code suggestions, you can also use Azure Data Studio as well as NeoVim. Now, are there any other editors supported? By GitHub officially, no. These are the only ones supported. Are there third-party unofficial extensions that you can use? I have found some. For example, one of the groups of people that I do teaching for, they like to use Emacs. So someone asked me, could they use Copilot with Emacs? I did a little searching online and I found an unofficial plugin that allows you to use Copilot code suggestions only in Emacs. So if you have another editor that you like to use, it might be worth the time to go look for an unofficial extension to see if you can connect that into Copilot. To my knowledge, there are no unofficial extensions that support chat, but there are some unofficial extensions that do support the Copilot code suggestions. And I've seen that myself in terms of setting it up with Emacs. Okay. Now, I'm going to flip over to the GitHub website here for just a brief moment. On the GitHub website, they actually have two web pages that talk about the different extensions. I'm going to drop these links into the chat. This first one covers the code suggestions. You'll see there's the 5 editors that are supported. So I'll drop that link into there. There is also the page that shows you the Copilot chat. While it's all really just Copilot, technically because of the evolution of the product, Copilot chat is treated as a separate kind of thing, a separate feature. And I'll drop the link to this in the chat. There's the link to that, okay? I think I see a question here about the price. So I, of course, don't set pricing for GitHub, but if my memory is correct, I believe it's $10 a month for the individual license, or maybe $100 for the year. And then for the business license, which your employer would pay for, that's $20 a month. And I believe the enterprise license is $40 a month. So if you're just an individual freelance developer, I think I paid $100 a year when I first signed up for it. Okay. All right. So one thing I want to mention about these two web pages here, they have the instructions for installing the extension, getting logged in, and all the little hotkeys and stuff that you can use to interact with the various features of the extensions. And the cool thing is with these instructions, you can pick your editor and it gives you the instructions that are specific to that editor. So definitely take a look at those two links if you want to learn how to install the extension into your editor and start making use of it. Okay, back over to here. So Copilot, it's powered by generative AI. As you all know, Microsoft owns GitHub. Microsoft made a huge, $10 billion investment in OpenAI. So between Microsoft, OpenAI, and GitHub, they are the 3 companies that work together to provide the Copilot service, which is, of course, the actual, service online, but then all the stuff that it does behind the scenes in terms of the generative AI models and making the code suggestions and things like that. Now, one of the interesting questions people often have about Copilot is, what about the security of our code? People are always wondering, if we have private code repositories in our business, is Copilot being trained off of those private repos? When you type into the editor and you send code up to Copilot to give you back suggestions, what's happening to that code, right? So let's just go ahead and address that question here real quick before we even get into seeing how awesome the tool is. So Copilot, and keep in mind, by the way, I do not work for GitHub. I am not on the Copilot programming team. I am not sitting there in the data center watching where all the little bytes go back and forth for using Copilot. I am sharing with you what I know from what I've read in GitHub's documentation and from what I understand about the product. So if there's any area here in which I am incorrect or in error, it is simply by accident. Please forgive me. But ultimately, all things related to the terms and services and stuff from GitHub, I'd refer you back to officially GitHub to answer those for you. But from my understanding, from what I've read, the way this basically works is that Copilot is only trained on publicly available code. That would definitely apply to any public repositories on GitHub. I'm not sure if they use other public sources. They quite possibly could, but it's only trained on public code. Any private code, any code that's part of your organization or business, that is not included in the training whatsoever. All of that is private. Now, here's the thing. One of the big mistakes that people will make with Copilot is they think that Copilot is like copying and pasting code. That's not the case. Copilot goes off, learns about programming, so to speak, and then makes generative suggestions to you, right? So, for example, I'll often be asked, well, what about plagiarism or license type violations, stuff like that? It's kind of like this. If I go off and learn how to do a bunch of programming and you ask me a question on how to solve a problem, and I sit down with your editor and I'm like, oh yeah, just type out some code here to do this. How would you know if there was plagiarism or license violations? How would you go through my history of programming to figure out if I was somehow exactly copying somebody's code or copying their idea? You can't. There's no way to know that. I'm just generating the code for you based upon my experience. That's how Copilot works. Copilot learns a lot, but Copilot's not copying and pasting code. Copilot is literally generating the code from its training. There would be no way to know where that code came from. Now, it is possible that the code that it generates could match existing public code, just like if any of us were to write a for loop, our for loop might match some type of public code already in existence, right? There's only so many ways to write a for loop. But in terms of copying and paste, that doesn't happen. For people who are using GitHub for business, GitHub does give you the ability to block code suggestions when that suggestion matches existing public code. So if the generative AI creates something that just happens to match existing public code, it will block the suggestion. But the truth is, if I were to analyze your code base, I'd probably find a fair amount of code that matches public code, not because somebody copied and pasted, but because there's only so many ways to do something. So you can turn off any suggestions that match public code if you want to with GitHub for Business, but you'll also lose a lot of the value of Copilot because so much of the code we just type anyways is going to match something that exists out in the public space. Now, what exactly is actually sent up to GitHub servers when you get suggestions back? So as you're typing in your editor, Copilot will include any code that is in the area that you're typing. It can include any files that you have opened in your editor. It can also include any specific files that you reference, such as when you're chatting, you can say, oh, reference this particular file. Copilot will include that in the code that it sends up to the Copilot server to get your suggestions. That code that is sent up, once it is used to formulate a suggestion, that code is immediately deleted on GitHub servers and it is not retained. Also, once the response, the suggestions are sent back to you, the suggestions themselves are also immediately deleted. So GitHub does not retain any of the code that you send up to generate the suggestions. It also does not retain the suggestions either. So the question then is, what does Copilot actually keep? Well, the Copilot service is a service like any other service. GitHub will retain for 24 months usage data on the service. So what editor are you using? What types of, how many requests are being made? How many suggestions are being sent back? Is a suggestion being accepted? So it's not so much tracking the actual content of the suggestion, but was the suggestion accepted? Through this type of interactivity data, GitHub can measure what editors people are using so it knows where to invest the time and money on building out extensions. By knowing whether or not people are accepting the suggestions, it knows whether or not the retraining of the model is generating more value over the earlier training of the model, so on and so forth. So there is some interactivity data, but all of it is pseudo-anonymized, and none of it has any of the actual code that you either sent up or any of the code suggestions that are sent back, okay? All right, so what is a generative AI model? We kind of use this term all the time now. Most people probably have a good idea of what it means, but let's just give a quick little definition here. This is from NVIDIA. Generative AI enables users to quickly generate new content based on a variety of inputs. Inputs and outputs of these models can include text, images, sounds, animation, 3D models, or other types of data. Generative AI models use neural networks to identify patterns and structures and then generate new and original content. So what I said before about it not copying and pasting, it's not copying and pasting other people's code. It just learns how to do things. And as we all know, when we learn how to do something, if we look at the stuff we start producing, it probably does bear some similarity to the things we were trained on. Okay, so is GitHub Copilot perfect? Right, what's interesting is we accept the fact that human beings are not perfect, right? We know that when programmers write code, they're going to make mistakes. When we get a tool like Copilot, though, we ask ourselves the question, is it always going to generate perfect code? Is it always going to generate the best code? Is it always going to do things the most efficient way? Is it always going to follow best practices? It's funny, we expect Copilot to do that, but none of us would actually ever be able to code that way. It doesn't matter how experienced you are. You will make mistakes. There will be things you don't know. There will be things that change that you're not aware of. The thing about Copilot is, if you hold it to the standard of perfection, it's never going to achieve that. But if you ask yourself, does it do a good job overall? Can it do a better job than the actual programmer in many situations? When used as a pair programmer, can it add value? Can it increase your productivity in the code that you're writing? And the answers to all of those questions are yes. If you think of Copilot as merely a code generator and you just always accept the code that it suggests and assuming that it's going to be perfect, you're going to be very disappointed. But if you use it as a pair programmer to help you speed up the writing of your code, get suggestions on code that might be new to you, get some insight on how to solve technical challenges, have some explanations on new code you've never looked at before, fix bugs and improve code, learn new programming languages, even discuss programming concepts. Copilot does all of these things very, 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 very well. So we don't want to hold Copilot to the standard of perfection because it's just not going to do that. Generative AI doesn't work that way. In order for generative AI to be beneficial and understand the context, we have to allow for the fact that it's going to make some mistakes, okay? So we're going to actually take a look here at how to use Copilot. I'm going to focus most of my time just in VS Code, doing some demonstrations and explaining some things. I'll also briefly show you Visual Studio and JetBrains just so you can see that it all looks the same over there too. But I'll fire those up right at the end of the demonstration. But we're going to focus now here on actually using Copilot in the editor itself. So I've got a VS Code opened up here. And if you come over here, you'll see I've got my Copilot extension installed, okay? And over here, you can see Copilot's turned on, and I'm also logged into my GitHub account here. So you have to have the actual subscription, and you've got to have the extension installed, but once you do, you're good to go. Now, out of all the languages that you can use Copilot with, probably the one that has the absolute best support is Python. So I thought we would take a look at a couple of examples here of using Python with Copilot, and let's see what it can do for us. Okay. So I figured we'd start over here with the Copilot chat. Here's the little chat window. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Copilot to help me get started with a little Python program. So I'll come into Copilot and say, I am working on a new Python program. I need to create a console-based Python program that will add two numbers together. I'm just going to talk to it in human language. Let's see what it comes back with. Okay. So take a look. It's going to suggest to me that I create a function called add two numbers, and it's going to give me some code here that I can work with. Okay. So let's see here. Before I copy and paste that code over. Oh, and one other thing I'll mention is notice the explanation. It actually gives you explanations on the code that it suggests to you, which is really, really nice. But before I copy and paste this over, I think I'd like to incorporate Python type hints. I teach a lot of Python classes, and what's interesting is probably 95% of my students in my Python classes have never used Python type hints before. And then when I start using them in the class, they get confused because they're like, what are these type hint things all about? So let's say I had never used type hints before, and I wanted Copilot to show me how to use them here. No problem. I'm just going to say, please update this code to use type hints. Hey, take a look at that. Now I've got type hints that I can work with. So we'll go ahead and copy this code. And what's nice is I can create a little file over here. We'll say new file. We'll call it app.py. Then we'll come over to here, and I'm just going to simply paste that in over here. I've got my little Python program. I'll come into here and say Python app py, and we'll put in our number, and there's our sum. Now, I happen to know just how to fire off the Python program, but what if I didn't? Could Copilot help me fire off the Python program? Sure, it could. I could come into here, and I could use the terminal scope, and I could say, please tell me how to run my Python program. Okay, so here it's going to tell me to say Python and then whatever my file name. Here it is, app.py. Okay, now what's cool with this is you can actually come into here and insert this into the terminal. Of course, I'd have to modify this to say app.py, and then I have my program running there. Now, that's the coolness of the chat. In the actual Copilot course, we actually build a full-blown REST API. Generally, it's a REST API in the language of your choice using Copilot chat. We assume that you have no knowledge of the language, maybe some basic programming experience, maybe a little bit of REST API knowledge, but definitely no knowledge of the language or the framework. And we actually use Copilot to build the entire thing from scratch, both the Copilot chat as well as the in-editor suggestions, okay? So we're just kind of doing a little small subset of what we do in the actual course. But in the course, you'd build out a whole program using Copilot every step of the way to explain the language, the frameworks, the concepts and the ideas, so on and so forth. Now, let's say I wanted to enhance this application to support subtraction and multiplication and division. Okay, so I already have this file open. I could highlight the code. I can also come down here and put the asterisk, or not asterisk, a pound sign or hashtag, and say file, And I'm going to automatically include file app py in here. And I'm going to ask it this. Please upgrade the code to support addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. The user should be prompted for the desired math operation. Also, allow the user to run multiple math operations and to exit the program, they will type exit. Now, before I hit enter on this, I want to highlight something to you. I've probably taught over the last few months, probably around 30 of these Copilot classes. It's been a huge thing that I've been doing a lot of teaching for across lots of time zones at that. So some classes starting at like 1 o'clock in the morning and things like that. But while I've done this many times, and while I have the usual set of demos and stuff that I use when I teach, what I'm doing here for you right now is completely live and unrehearsed, other than I have a good knowledge of what Copilot can do. I'm typing this out and showing you what it can do just by having a normal interaction with it, because that's the power of Copilot. Copilot isn't something that you have to go off and learn a bunch of complicated things to get up and running with it. For as powerful and amazing as it is, a lot of people overcomplicate what it is. They overcomplicate it at the management level. They overcomplicate it at the developer level. They think it's going to be some big thing that has to be like rolled out in stages and stuff like that. And you're going to need, 10 years of training to become an expert at it or to believe in what it can do for you. It doesn't work like that. It's intuitive and straightforward. In the class, what we focus in on is we focus in on a lot of the technical stuff that I explained earlier and some additional things. We also focus in on how do you write your prompts? How do you interact with Copilot? We give you a lot of ideas and suggestions and practical ways of interacting with it through the prompt system. But even if you don't know that, it's so intuitive, it's just like talking to another person. So let's hit enter and let's see what it generates for me. Right, you will not get, so I'm seeing this in the chat here real quick. Yes, you will get different answers. It's non-deterministic. That's the nature of generative AI. That's why I tell you it's not copying and pasting. When you interact with Copilot, it's not like reading an answer from the database. It's kind of like if you talk to a programmer today for an answer, they'd give you, or ask a developer today a question, you get one answer, ask them tomorrow, you get something slightly different. Maybe the way you ask the question, maybe the way you emphasize certain words, maybe conditions in the office have changed. And so they give you a slightly different answer. Copilot is very much like that. It gives you very contextually aware answers, which means that you don't always get the exact same response back. That's why you still have to have knowledge of programming. You still have to have knowledge of your tooling. You still have to have all of that, but it's able to really help you out with these contextualized responses. Let's take a look at the code that it produced. So here I've got my perform operation. Here I've got my while loop. It put all that together for me. So I'm just going to come into here. I'll just delete that and let's kind of throw this in there. And now I've got my program here. Now, is this code the absolute best way to do this? Maybe, maybe not. Is there a more optimized way of doing it? Possibly. But I want to use this little illustration here to kind of point out something I think is important to consider. Imagine you're back in the 1960s and you're writing assembly language code. And a programmer comes to you and says, hey, we have this new language called the C programming language, late 60s, early 70s. And we'd like you to use that instead of assembly. You know what a lot of those assembly language programmers probably said? Well, if I start using C, I won't have control over the individual processor operations. And maybe the C programming code won't be quite as efficient in the way that it handles functions and other things like that. So I don't want to use C because I lose too much control. I want to keep programming in assembly. Now, if I came to any of us and said, please build your next web application in assembly language, everybody would think that I was crazy for suggesting that. And I would be crazy for suggesting it because it'd be a lot of assembly code to write. But the point is, whenever people go from a lower level language to a higher level language, there's always some type of sacrifice you have to make in terms of having control over things. Well, just like when you go from C up to Java or up to C#, or you go to something like Python itself. Honestly, Python is one of the most inefficient languages out there. Really, it's one of the slowest and most inefficient. But is that really a problem? Not really, because people are super productive with it. And paying programmers is the most expensive part of any project. Not only that, things like I/O operations are always slower, even if Python is inefficient. So when a Python program is slow, it's very rarely because of the Python. It's mostly the I/O operations that are slowing it down. But the point is, Python makes developers be more productive, but they do give up a lot of control over the operations being executed on the CPU. When I come to Copilot and it generates all this code for me in like a minute, and people are like, well, you know, it could be a little more efficient, it could be a little bit faster. It's kind of like the assembly language programmer saying, I want to keep programming in assembly instead of C. Now, if the code is slow, do I have to have the skills and ability to go in there and make it a little faster? Sure, I do. Just like many of the early C programmers would do inline assembly and stuff like that. But in the long term, the most expensive part of software is paying people to write it. So when we have tools like this that allow us to generate code that's good, maybe not as perfect as it could be, think about how much more productive we are, how much faster software can get rolled out, and how much better that is for the companies that we work with and our clients. And so as you can see, I generated a fair amount of code here very quickly. Do I still need to code review it? Absolutely. But does it have to be perfect? No, but you know what, the truth be told, even the code that I was going to write probably wasn't perfect. So we have to keep all that in mind when measuring our expectations for what Copilot can do or not do for us. Real quick, I'm going to come into here and run this. Let's see if it actually works. We'll say add 2, 3, and then we can do exit. Now, one really neat thing about Copilot we can do is I can highlight this code here and watch this. Copilot, generate docs. There you go. How many of us like to take the time to go through and actually document the code that we're working on? Nobody likes to do that. With Copilot, though, you can come in here and start documenting all of your methods. Think about how much more helpful that's going to be to other programmers who have to come in and look at your code. What's interesting is in a lot of my Python classes, I'll ask my students, why do we include this line of code in our Python program, right? Most of my students don't know, even those who have been using Python for years. So I'll come in here, I'll right click, I'll say Copilot, explain this. And let's see what Copilot comes back with an answer for. So it's a common Python idiom and checks to see if the script is being run directly or it's being imported as a module. And that's actually the correct answer, right? So I can go through and I can get explanations, especially on code that maybe I've used for years, but never really thought about what it does. I've just kind of copied and pasted it, right? Let's be honest. When most of us went off to school and we got our degrees in computer science and stuff and became software developers, we thought that we'd be implementing all of these really cool algorithms and stuff like that and discovering all these new things in computer science and writing really awesome software. Well, what happens when you get into the average corporate job? The average corporate job, you copy and paste code and swap out nouns and verbs, right? You go to add a new feature to an existing piece of software, you copy a bunch of code that somebody else has already created, and then you make modifications to it to incorporate that new plugin or whatever into the software that you're working on. How much of that plugin code do you really pay attention to? Do you really know what it's doing? A lot of times in my C# classes, I'll ask the programmers in the class, those who've been using C# for 20 years, I'll have them try to explain some of the auto-generated project code that Visual Studio creates for you. Most of the time, they're not really sure what it's doing. And that's because when we copy and paste, we don't really pay attention. Well, with Copilot, we can go back to that initial code and we can go in there and we can have it explain to us what that code is doing. We can learn what that generated code is contributing to the project. That's what I mean by Copilot. It's not just, or pair programming, AI pair programmer, not just the fact that it generated some code, but I have the ability to do discussions and stuff with it. Now I'm going to throw in one additional little example here of the code suggestions. And we'll just call this sample.py. A common demo that you'll see when people want to demonstrate code suggestions is they'll type in a comment like this. Add 3 numbers together. Now, what is Copilot going to give back to me? I don't know, right? It could give me back a bunch of comments. It could give me back some actual code. Usually it gives me back a function like this. Boom. But here's the cool thing. I'm not limited to just giving it something simple like adding 3 numbers together. I can do something like this. Generate a list of 100 random numbers between 1 and 1,000. Okay, so I have my random numbers there, right? But I'm going to change that. I'm going to say, write a function that generates a list. All right, so now we get into the comment. I don't like the fact that it did this during my demo, but I'm kind of glad that it did, because this is an example of sometimes where Copilot can go a little haywire. So what I'm going to do is, there we go. Now I get my function. I think it's when I put write, it interprets that as generating documentation. So really, I should just say function. But anyways, there's my random numbers. You know why it's including the documentation, by the way? Because I included the documentation over here. So it's picking up on this and including the documentation here because of that. But anyways, now I'm going to do this. A function that generates some descriptive statistics for a list of numbers. Okay, so there are some basic stats, but it doesn't have everything that I want. What if I want to have on here, including the population variance? So I'll just delete this and let it recreate it for me. All right, there you go. So it generates the population variance. Some languages that I work with, it actually does all the math calculations. And it'll actually give me the population variance versus the sample variance and stuff like that, with the degrees of freedom being handled a little bit differently. But you can see it can generate a lot of code here for you. And it actually knows what descriptive stats are. Pretty cool, right? So anyways, you can use the code suggestion tool. And when you're typically just coding things out, like if, for example, if I came down to here and I just said, name, look at that. It gives me a bunch of code and then I can go in and tweak it. Now, if you just start hitting tab and just accepting all the suggestions and not reading it, that's a bad thing to do. That's just like copying and pasting from Stack Overflow and running it. You do need to code review what's being generated as you're working with it. The last little demo I'm going to do here for you, and then we'll quickly open up Visual Studio and PyCharm so you can see what it looks like being installed there, is I want to come back over to our app Py and our chat window. And I want to show you something very interesting here. So I'm going to include my file, app Py. Please write this program in JavaScript with Node.js. Pretty cool, right? Okay. Please write this program in the Rust language. And what you're going to find here is that you still need to know the languages you're working with. But the languages, in a very real way, start to become an implementation detail. Think about when you write a program with .NET and you can run it on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Right, that's different operating systems. You can even run it on different chip architectures. Do you worry about the details of the operating system or the chip architecture? No, those are implementation details handled by the .NET runtime. Here, I'm allowing the Copilot runtime, so to speak, to handle the creation of this program in any language that I want. And we'll do one last one here. We'll say a file. And then let's do, please write this program in Haskell. Haskell is a functional programming language that's notoriously hard to work with. Some people really love it and think it's super cool, but it's a pretty tough language to work with. It's very different in how it works. And we've just produced this in Haskell. So anyways, the reason I mention all this is to say you're going to start to look at programming languages not as unnecessary, because different languages have different features that solve certain problems in terms of actually executing code. Some programs are great for concurrent execution. Some programs have to be written in JavaScript if you want to run it in the browser, so on and so forth. So it's not that programming languages go away, but you do start to see the beginning here of how they could start to become an implementation detail, kind of like we don't really worry about an x86 processor versus an ARM processor for standard business programming. Now, if you're a device driver writer, stuff like that, that's a different story. But if you're just building business applications, we don't really think about those types of details. Okay, before I open it up to questions here, or go through and look at the questions we've been getting, let me open up Visual Studio here. I'm not actually going to code anything. I just want to show you what it looks like to have Copilot in here, so you know it basically looks exactly the same. That's one thing that's kind of nice about this, is it doesn't really matter whether it's JetBrains, VS Code, or Visual Studio. There's the Copilot interaction right there. And Copilot itself is actually installed as an extension. So there's the Copilot chat, and there's Copilot. The same thing is also true for working with PyCharm. So if I open up PyCharm here, now one thing with JetBrains, in JetBrains, there's only one plugin you have to install to get both the Copilot and the Copilot chat. The other two, you have to install 2 extensions, but with PyCharm, there's only one extension. And we'll just say create a new project here, and I'll just say create. And if you go over here, see the little Copilot icon? If you click on this, it's the same Copilot chat as we had before. So the UI interface is exactly the same, regardless of which editor that you use. What are some other features you can use with it that we didn't talk about here? You can generate unit tests. You can have it solve coding problems. It can detect static problems as well as potential problems that would occur at runtime, not because it runs the code, but it recognizes the patterns that lead to those problems at runtime. And like I said, it works with just about any language that you're going to want to use. I teach classes with it for C++, Python, Golang, Java, C#, JavaScript, TypeScript. Am I an expert at all of those languages? No, but I don't have to be, because Copilot enables me to write the code in those languages. I've had some classes where we've just picked a language out of the blue that nobody knows, and we've written the same program with it. Does it mean it's ready to go to production? No, you need somebody who probably knows the language to review it, but it's amazing what you can do with Copilot. All right, let me go ahead and take a quick look here at some of the questions that we've received, and I'll do my best to answer all of them. So Copilot for Business, yeah, your code remains within your organization. Like, your code goes up for a few moments to Copilot to get the suggestions, but But GitHub's not taking your organization's code. It's not training off of it. It's not giving it to anybody else. It's not making suggestions to other people with it. Okay. All right, let's see here. High level interaction. Right. So I'm not familiar with all the details of how Copilot is actually implemented up in the cloud and how it gets trained and how it integrates with OpenAI. I just know that it's using their learning models to provide the suggestions to us. Let's see here. Okay, so let me talk about this question here about junior developers. So this is like the number one concern that people have concerning using things like Copilot is, what about junior developers? So I have a couple of thoughts on that. Number one, I've worked with a lot of senior developers who don't know the language as well as they should. A lot of times they don't even know the latest features of the language. So maybe they learned Java 10, 15 years ago, and when you read their code today, it's the same code they wrote 15 years ago, and they haven't learned any of the new features. So I think the struggle of, do I understand what Copilot is creating? I think that's a problem that plagues all developers, not just the junior developers or the senior developers. A lot of times, the junior developers will be more aware of the newer features because that's what they started learning, as opposed to the senior developers who might be coding things kind of the old way. As I mentioned to you, I've been writing code professionally for 27 years. When I have used Copilot to code review my code, like I'll write some code and ask Copilot, is there a better way to write this? I have been surprised at times at some of the suggestions that it made to me, and those suggestions were actually better than the way I wrote it. And I could have sworn the way I wrote it was the best way to do it. So all of us have room for improvement. If you use Copilot as a pair programmer and you ask it to review your code and you review the code that it creates for you and you discuss the code being created, you'll have a lot less likely chance of incorporating code that's bad code. Okay. But the key is the programmer has to take the time to interact with Copilot to go over it and make sure they understand it. You have the same problem with Stack Overflow. It's just with Stack Overflow, you have to go through a Google search first, copy paste before you run into the problem. With Copilot, it just, puts the code right in the editor. So if you just hit and tab, like as I mentioned before, you can't think of it really as just a code generator. All right. Let's see. So in terms of Copilot, it's receiving the code from your editor. In terms of how it's processing that code, I'm not familiar with that. I don't create the large language models. AI, in terms of creating AI learning models, that's not my specialty. I just use the tool, and so it sends your code up, it does the processing that it does, and gives you back the code suggestions. Overall efficiency by adopting Copilot. This is really hard to measure. Copilot or GitHub and Microsoft, they have their numbers and stuff. And if you go to the GitHub site, it'll say, oh, it makes everybody 50% more efficient. But how do you measure that? I had a customer of mine say, well, we have access to some secret APIs that will tell us how many suggestions people are really accepting. And I said, though, but what does that really tell you? I could accept a suggestion because it's 50% correct and I'm going to modify it. That doesn't mean the suggestion was correct. It just means that I was going to have to go in and tweak it. I could accept the whole suggestion and it could be wrong. I could see the suggestion, choose not to accept it, be inspired by what I saw for a moment, and then write my own solution. How do you measure if it's making you more efficient or not? In terms of speed, that's a really hard thing to answer. And I'll be honest with you, as a developer, if I'm just giving you my opinion, I don't think of Copilot in terms of making me faster in terms of speed. I think of Copilot in terms of helping me to learn more and teach me more and give me more information about things that I did not realize I did not have. Now, Does it make me faster sometimes? Sure. If it writes a bunch of code and it looks good and I accept it, yeah, I didn't have to type all that out. But if I really go back and code review it and I see something novel that I've never tried before, then if I'm using Copilot correctly, I'm going to interact with Copilot to understand better the code that it created. Okay. In terms of clearing the context with Copilot, if you want to do like a new chat, you can click this. If you close all of your open files, it should be a new session. I can't guarantee you that it is, but it should be a new session. You, of course, can always reload Visual Studio Code, whatever, and that will also kind of reinitialize things. But if you've got the files closed and you've got your new chat there, you should be in a new session. In terms of training Copilot, you can't really do that. There are some newer things at the enterprise level with Copilot where you can create knowledge bases and even have it like understand your whole code repository. But from just a developer perspective, working in your editor, you don't really train it to do anything. It just uses the immediate context of the files you have open, the code that you're editing, and any files that you specifically reference. And it gives you the results based upon that. Okay. All right. What are the total savings productivity? Like I said, you can't really measure total savings and productivity. I will tell you this. I have not personally met any programmer who has used Copilot who came back and said it slowed them down or that it wasn't worth the investment. Now, if you go searching online, go to YouTube, you can find a few YouTubers out there who will talk about how they stopped using Copilot. They also stopped using the cloud. They only use Vim. They don't use any other public services and they've disconnected from everything. And now they're much happier doing that. You will find people with that perspective. But except for those people who are just really not going to use any type of service, most everybody that you come across online, YouTubers talking about Copilot, other programmers who are using it, everybody finds it's beneficial. Now, does everybody find it beneficial to the degree that Microsoft or GitHub might promote the stats? Probably not. Do people find it beneficial in different ways? Like for me, the big thing is about learning stuff. For me, it's not the code generation. It's the ability to learn and go deeper and work in new languages. For other people, if they just don't want to type, the code generation might be the big thing for them. But I find that Copilot, as simple as it is so amazing in how the generative AI works that you get to work with your AI pair programmer in the way that's most comfortable for you. Okay. All right. Let me check the chat here for any questions. We have the chat and the Q&A. Give me a second here. All right. Okay. So I'm probably not going to be able to get to all of these, but let me take a quick look here real quick. Yes, you can use Copilot to learn how to create Python packages. I actually had to do that. So I teach Python classes, but as you know, you can do PyPy packages, you can do Conda packages, things like that. I had a class that I taught where we did a bunch of Python, C extensions for Python, and we needed to package them up with the various package management mechanisms. And if you've ever gone online and tried to look up how to do that, you'll find all these different versions and variations of how to do packaging stuff in Python. As part of that course that I was creating to put all the instructions together in the courseware, I found that Copilot was extremely helpful for anything related to Python, C programming, Python, as well as the various packaging mechanisms, make file configuration, stuff like that. Copilot has excellent, excellent support for that. And if you want to ask it questions like what is an egg, what's a wheel, stuff like that for Python packaging, it does a really great job in giving explanations on that. Okay. Copilot knows about any framework. So the person here is asking about Fast API. Copilot knows about any framework. If I came into here and said, please create a simple Python fast API application for me. And you could pick anything. You could say, please create a Rust Actix Web REST API. It doesn't matter because remember, it's trained on all the public code. So as long as people are using a framework or whatever, it can generate it. Okay. All right. Now, the reason why I use the word please, and I actually have really cut back. I used to be a lot more conversational with my pair programmer. But the reason why I use please is I try to think of my pair programmer as a fellow programmer, right? So I try to be nice to it and treat it with respect. And people laugh when I tell them that. But the way that I work with it is I don't want to think of it as just some code generator. I want to think of it as a pair programmer. And so part of that is conditioning myself mentally to work with Copilot as a fellow programmer. And so that's why I try to use some niceties like please and stuff like that. Sometimes I'll even give it a whole story. You know, I don't know very much about Python and my manager wants me to build this application and I'm not really in the mood. What's the fastest way that I can go? Kind of like what you'd say to another person if you were working on a project. And believe it or not, Copilot will adjust its answer. If you tell it you're brand new, it'll give you step-by-step instructions. If you tell it you're experienced, it'll give you a short summary on how to do something. It really does factor in context, not just of the code itself, but you as the person interacting with it. Okay, let's see here. See here. I'm looking through the chats here real quick just to pick up any questions that are there. Okay. Yeah, so, you know, sometimes the code you get just won't be very good code. It could be because there's something wrong with the AI tooling. It could also be because we're not good at asking questions. One of the first things I discovered when I started using ChatGPT was I wasn't good at asking questions. I made too many assumptions about what the AI might be thinking. And I kind of learned that I was probably making those assumptions in my human conversations as well. And so I found working with ChatGPT and Copilot Chat have actually helped me do a better job in talking to real people, because now I think more about how I'm asking my question, what details I'm including or not including, which I didn't necessarily really pay that much attention to before I just spoke, right? Well, with Copilot, you get to iterate very quickly on asking questions and having technical discussions, and it does a good job. It's kind of like when you're using Grammarly, right? Grammarly points out your errors as you're typing. Well, over time, you start to write better text because you learn the lessons that Grammarly is pointing out to you. I find the same thing is true when interacting with Copilot. All right. I don't know anything about support for Eclipse, unfortunately. I know a lot of people use that editor, but I'm not aware. Okay, so the evolution of programming. Here's what I tell my students. So I've been incorporating AI into my classes for the last year and a half. So I didn't originally incorporate AI, but as people started to become more aware of it and more curious about it, I started incorporating it into parts of my classes. You have to be careful, though, because as an instructor, if you're teaching and everything is being generated by AI, the students start to question how much you actually know about the topic. So, so I try to limit the use of it, but I do demonstrate how to use it so they can make use of it in their coding. And here's what I tell all of my students. If you are a person who's been in the industry 30, 40 years, you're probably looking at retirement in the next 10 or 15 years. You're probably going to be okay with how we do the coding today. As great as Copilot is, as great as the AI is, we still need programmers to write curly braces and parentheses and stuff like that. However, for those of you who are new, your programming career is going to look very different than the one that I've had. The one I've had for the last 30 years, curly braces and semicolons, was very different than the previous generations had, where they had to use punch cards, right? So we've gone through this transition before, from vacuum tubes to transistors to doing punch cards to actually having computer terminals and editors to having full-blown IDEs and code completion. And now we're making the next transition with the generative AI stuff, the copilots and such. For those of you who are new to programming, like you're early in your career, and I mean from like a young age. I mean, if you're 70 and you're new to programming, you're probably not going to be programming for the next 20 years. But if you're in your 20s, you are probably going to have a very, very different career ahead of you than what mine has been. Yours is not going to be focused in on curly braces and parentheses and semicolons. Yours is going to be focused in on higher level abstractions. The time that I spent typing in semicolons and curly braces, you're going to be able to spend that time solving bigger and more complex problems. You see, computer science originally started off with, how do I manipulate the processor, right? Then eventually we moved past the processor and lower level memory management to, how do I work in relatively simple and basic abstractions. That's really what most programming we do today is. It's mostly in simple or basic abstractions, right? It might seem complex to us, but they're simple and basic abstractions compared to what's coming in the future. However, when we write that code, we still have to focus in on some things like semicolons and curly braces and stuff like that. However, for the next generation, you're going to be focusing in on higher level, much more complex abstractions. You're not going to be dealing with the details of parentheses and curly braces like I am today, just like I don't deal with writing the assembly code of generations before. And so for those of you who are young, you definitely want to learn everything you can about how to use this tooling to make you more efficient, to make you more knowledgeable, how to make yourself more productive. Because when you go to get the job interview, it's not just going to be, can you accomplish some type of exercise on LeetCode? It's going to be, do you know how to use this tooling to actually build real software? And you'll be surprised, it's not going to be about the semicolons. It's going to be about those higher level concepts and ideas that you're going to have to be able to utilize the AI to help you build. A good example of this is if you think about the Iron Man movies, right? I think it was Jonathan Stark was his name, and he wanted to create the Iron Man suit. When he went back to his lab to create the Iron Man suit, he wasn't, firing up the fire pit to like break out the blacksmith hammer and start, banging the metal into shape. He wasn't breaking out the screwdriver and screwing the pieces of the Iron Man suit together. He used his computer and his AI to design the suit. And then he used all of the tooling that he had, all powered by AI, to build the Iron Man suit. So was he still technically involved? Did he have to know a lot of stuff to build it? Yeah, but he didn't have to figure out how to use a lathe or how to cut sheet metal. That was all done for him by his tooling. That's what's going to happen with programming in the long run. We're still going to have programmers, but they're just not going to be focused in on curly braces and semicolons, just like I don't worry about opcodes to the CPU anymore. Hopefully that analogy makes sense to everybody. All right, cool. All right. I can't speak too much to COBOL. You can have it generate COBOL for you. If I came into here and opened up AppPy, and I come into here and I did a file, and we'll say, please generate the COBOL version of this code, it'll generate it for you. But in terms of how that works on COBOL systems, that would be an example of something where I'd have to know more details about something. It's not just enough to know Copilot. I'd have to know something more about COBOL and the actual systems that it runs on. But yes, it did generate the COBOL program. And I always like to do this one for fun. And I don't know if it'll generate the whole thing here, but please generate the ARM64 assembly for this code. So it's going to tell me that I can't do it. But if I had a simpler C program, it would give me the ARM assembly for it. Okay. Anyways, I want to thank you all. Thank you all so much for attending the webinar today. I hope some of the demonstrations, but also a lot of the concepts to you were helpful. I know everyone has a variety of views on AI, usage of Copilot and stuff like that. And so hopefully I've given you some things to think about here in terms of what Copilot is, how to use it, examples of using it, and what the role of Copilot and AI will be in the future for all of us. Okay. And I appreciate everyone taking the time to attend, and I apologize for going a little bit over, but I hope it was interesting for all of you, and I wish you all the best.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Eric. Sorry, my audio kind of broke through there for a second. But I wanted to thank you so much. And thanks for everyone who came, because you made it so fun and interactive with all of your wonderful questions. And Eric, thank you for staying and answering them all as well.
Sure.
This was great, and wonderful job. And I did have to, I laughed a little bit inside because I also say please when I'm working with Gemini, because I just feel like I should.
Right, right.
Can I just bear with me 1 second? I'm going to just see if I can share my screen for a second.
Of course, I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, just want to see if you can see Introduction to GitHub Copilot training. There, it should be coming up right now. Yes, okay. So this is the link that I put in the chat. We'll also be sending you this out when we send the recorded video. So that will be coming out for you tomorrow. But, you know, this is just a snapshot with Eric. But, you know, if you liked an hour with Eric, the only thing better is a whole day with Eric, or a half day with Eric, or any amount of time you can get with Eric. And if you're just one or two people and you need to be trained, we do have an online virtual class scheduled for April 22nd. Yeah, you'll get the URL. And thank you everyone so much again. I'll go ahead and release you out into the world. You were so nice to stick with us, and we really appreciate it. Have a wonderful day, everybody. And Eric, thank you again so much for this. And we hope to see you all next time on our next webinar.
Thank you.
Okay, bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye everybody.
Bye.